I'm Charles Calhoun. I'm the author of The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, and you're watching Author's Voice.
Welcome to A House Divided. My name is Bjorn Skaptason, and I am your host today on Author's Voice, virtual book signing network. We have a lot to talk about today about one thing, about one person. Today we're going to talk about Ulysses S. Grant. In fact, this is going to be the fall of Ulysses S. Grant, the autumn of Ulysses S. Grant on Author's Voice. A lot of great Grant scholarship is coming out right now. And we have a lot to talk about. We have two great books and two fascinating authors, so let's jump right in and start talking about our books and our authors today. The first book we have, and the first author I want to introduce, is if you don't mind, the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. And you've probably heard of it before, but this version is from the Belknap Press of Harvard University Press. First edition, 784 pages. It costs $39.95. And you can get a signed first edition of Grant's memoirs. With us today to discuss it is the principal editor of the work, Dr. John Marszalek. John is the W.L. Giles Distinguished Professor Emeritus and Executive Director and Managing Editor of the U.S. Grant Association's U.S. Grant Presidential Library. And that's at Mississippi State University. John's also the author of The Petticoat Affair. I wanted to lead with that since everything else is going to be about men.
Right.
The author of The Petticoat Affair, the commander of all Lincoln's armies, and Sherman, A Soldier's Passion for Order, and many other writings. Also with us today, Charles W. Calhoun. Charles is the author of The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, and that is from the University Press of Kansas. First edition, 721 pages, illustrated. It is also $39.95. Chuck is the Thomas Harriot College Distinguished Professor of History Emeritus at East Carolina University. He's the author of Conceiving a New Republic, the Republican Party and the Southern Question, 1869 to 1900, and the author of Minority Victory, Gilded Age Politics, and the Front Porch Campaign of 1888. And since both of our guests today wear the Distinguished Emeritus badge on their CVs, we can say that both of them are authors of innumerable amounts of scholarship, fine scholarship in their fields of study. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Divided. And yes, we are here to talk about Ulysses S. Grant. And I want to start with my first question for you, John. Tell us about, before we even get into the book, could you tell us about the Ulysses S. Grant Association and the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The Ulysses S. Grant Association actually began in 1962 at the Ohio Historical Society, and then in 1964 moved to Southern Illinois University. In 1967, published the first of what became 32 volumes of the papers of Ulysses S. Grant, and came to Mississippi State in 2008 and has been there ever since. And what we do primarily is the Grant Association came into being during the centennial of the Civil War as a way to provide information on what was going on in the Civil War, and the Civil War commissions of 3 states, and some famous historians like Allen Nevins and Lloyd Lewis and others all decided they wanted to do something special, so they decided to collect writings of Grant. So we have, we believe, a copy at least, if not an original, of every letter Grant ever wrote and every letter ever written to him. So we are an organization that is there to provide information on Ulysses S. Grant.
Okay. And then, which gives me a chance to leap right into our first audience question. We've already got questions coming in from the audience, and I thank the audience for that. And I want to remind you, anybody that's home that wishes to ask a question anytime during this hour, you can do so. There's a button. There's a button right under your viewer. You can click on that, and you can send us a question. The question comes via instant messenger, so please put your name and where you're from. Otherwise, we don't know who you are, and we can't thank you. But the first question we got, John, is what is next for the U.S. Grant Museum and Association?
Great, that's a terrific question. Actually, November 30th of this year is the grand opening of our new facility. Mississippi State University built a 22,000 square foot facility on top of the Mitchell Memorial Library. And there we are going to have a gallery on Grant. We're going to have a gallery on Abraham Lincoln because Frank Williams, who's the president of the Grant Association, but also one of the great collectors of Lincoln, Lincolniana, as it's called. It's the Frank and Virginia Williams collection of Lincolniana. But it's an absolutely incredible piece. There's a gallery for that. We're also going to have an orientation room. We've got offices for staff. We've got a processing room. And the one that most people enjoy the most for a brief period is our cold storage room. We keep it 50 degrees, etc. So what's next for the Grant Association? What we want to do is we want to produce a digitized version of these Grant memoirs using the various issues that Grant went through in writing them originally. So we're going to do that. We also are working with the University of Virginia Press to digitize all of this material in our 32 volumes, and probably eventually this, to make it available in conjunction with all the other presidential collections around the nation, so that, for example, if you write in presidential sicknesses and we'll put it in, it'll punch in and it'll list you all the presidents and everything about them. So we're doing that, and something a little bit further down the road is going to be a cumulative index of all 32 of the volumes, and eventually we're going to do the memoirs of William T. Sherman too. So
oh, great.
We've got some things going down the road.
Well, we're going to get to the book itself in a minute, but thank you for updating us on the status of the Presidential Library, and I probably am going to want to ask you some more questions,
okay,
because I'm really fascinated about this project. But first, let's meet Charles Calhoun. And I gave everybody Charles Calhoun's biography a minute ago, but I want to introduce the topic of your book, which is the Presidency of US Grant. And one of the first things I noticed in your introduction is it has been a long time since a scholar dedicated an entire book to the presidency.
That's right, Bjorn. Let me first say about John's work, they do a terrific job at Mississippi State at the Presidential Library. I spent time there myself researching. It's wonderful staff and, of course, a terrific collection. So I commend their work, and I'm glad they're succeeding so well and expanding and doing all these wonderful projects. It has been a long time since there was a full-fledged scholarly work, or even a popular work, for that matter, devoted to Grant's administration, really dating back to the 1930s. Alan Nevins published a book. It was a biography of Hamilton Fish, the Secretary of State, but the subtitle was The Inner History of the Grant Administration. And William Heseltine wrote a book called Ulysses S. Grant, Politician. But since then, it's been mostly biographies that have emerged about Grant. And of necessity, of course, a biography deals with the whole life. And most people, I think, who are drawn to write those biographies of Grant are drawn to him by his military career. They have less interest, perhaps, in what he did in the White House. In some of the works, I think the coverage has been rather cursory. But I'm a political historian. I've been at this for about 50 years now, and not only the works you cited a moment ago, but other works I've written about the politics of the late 19th century, 1865 to 1900. And needless to say, Grant has played a pretty big role in several of those books. But it seemed to me that what we needed was a study that focused on Grant's presidency, his administration. That, I think, has been overlooked. And when it has been dealt with, I think that scholars have tended to, or other writers have tended to, look primarily at secondary sources, including those two books I mentioned back for the 1930s, and perhaps have purveyed somewhat misleading notions about what happened in that period. So I felt that I had the obligation. The University Press of Kansas has a series on the American presidency. They asked me to write the book. And I felt I had the obligation not to simply produce another synthesis, but to go back and do the original hard research. A lot of it at John's place, but the Library of Congress is really my second home. I spent the scores of manuscript collections there that I spent time with, Hamilton Fish's papers and Benjamin Bristow's papers and all those, and then repositories around the country, the Wisconsin Historical Society and Princeton and many other places that had collections related to Grant, collections of men who worked in Grant's time and interacted with him. So what I took it upon myself to do was to sort of, in a sense, benefit from what others had written about his presidency, but also, in a sense, to tune them out and start from scratch again and try to examine the various issues that Grant confronted during his years in the White House. And, of course, what I found was many of them were very, very complicated and needed a good bit of detail to explicate fully. And that's why the book is as big as it is, and that's why it took me to write it almost as much time as Grant spent in the White House. So, I think I've gotten to the bottom of many things that perhaps have been overlooked before.
Right. And to start at the end, meaning the life and time we're all living in right now, just as an observation, when I first read that in your book, it occurred to me, how long in my entire life have we been absolutely certain that U.S. Grant was one of the worst presidencies in the history? Every time they made the list, there he was down there at the bottom. Yet, the last time anybody wrote about it in a sincere, fulsome way was the 1930s, an entirely different world.
Right. You know, we suffer from, I think, confirmation bias, and writers and authors and scholars are not immune to that. And I think the story was out there, and it gets repeated. History may not repeat itself, but historians repeat other historians. And that happened for the first century, really, of scholarship about Grant's presidency, that the accepted truth was good enough, as it were. And I think part of the reason that negative impression got solidified in the early 20th century relates to Grant's work on Reconstruction. Most writers today do credit Grant with being a champion of Reconstruction, a defender of blacks' rights, and so forth. But those earlier works that set that in stone, that reputation of Grant in stone as a bad president, came out in the early 20th century when what we had in this country was what we might call the Jim Crow settlement, the racial settlement that lasted for basically a century until the Civil Rights Movement. And in that telling, in that story, Grant was a villain. Reconstruction was bad, it was oppressive of the South, and that sense of Grant as doing something very bad, and that's the way it was portrayed. Even Alan Nevins's book on Fish said the worst thing about Grant was he was trying to hold up these governments in the South that weren't worthy. And basically, he considered what we would call his civil rights record the worst part of his presidency. Today, we think that's one of his best. But that got confirmed in people's minds and got passed down and passed down. And the origin of that, I think, really dates back to Grant's own time. One of the things that I think complicates the Grant story is that he had many, many enemies, political enemies. Even before he took the oath of office, there were people who were gunning for him. And after he died, there was a rush to print by people who disliked him very much, and they wanted to get the negative story out. And scholars writing in the early 20th century did tend to read those negative accounts by Grant's contemporaries much more than those who defended him. And it gets solidified in the psyche and lasted really until, as I say, the civil rights movement, when people began reconsidering this guy.
Well, just to jump in, the other thing I think I agree completely with what Chuck said, but I think there's also the lost cause plays a role in all this. You know, the idea that the South may have lost the war, but they were the virtuous people. The North might have won the war, but they're a bunch of losers, and you can see it in Grant. He's a drunk. He's just name it right, butcher. The whole story. Well, that issue, to make Lee the great general, you've got to find someone who is going to be the great villain, and Grant fits that perfectly. Sherman does too, I think, in ways, but particularly Grant, because he was the leading figure. And so you read some of the things that are coming out, even though they're saying, well, Grant was really great at Appomattox because he was nice to us and all the rest, but you still see this kind of thinking. So I think Chuck's right. It's a question of here's this Grant, here's this story. Man, it's a great story, and it's easy to remember. Drunk, alcoholic, loser, etc. So you hang on to it, and then somebody like him comes along, or I hope the Grant in his own memoirs said something quite similar.
Yeah.
But they come along and say these things, and suddenly people are beginning to look at Grant in a different way, and that's why I think we have this great renaissance of Grant scholarship
about Grant.
Right.
Which brings us to the book that you're signing today, the personal memoirs of U.S. Grant. And like we did with Chuck, let's start at the end.
Okay.
My first question is start at the end. Now, there's a lot of myth and legend surrounding the context in which Grant's memoirs were written.
Right.
So can you briefly review the factual story of how the memoirs came to be?
Okay. The great myth, I mean, above everything else, we have to get this out of the way because somebody may have a question on this already. It is not true, absolutely not true at all, that Mark Twain wrote the memoirs.
Oh, darn, you took one of my questions.
You took, yeah. So that's one you can take. But basically what it came down to is Grant was actually, how can we put it, taken to the cleaners by a charlatan and a Ponzi scheme, a man named Ferdinand Ward. And what's particularly intriguing is one of the scholars of this period is a direct descendant of this fellow Ward. But anyway, Grant lost everything. I think he had $82 or something in his pocket, something like that, and his wife had, or maybe she had that in her purse or whatever. But the point was that Grant, about the same time he decides finally, he doesn't want to write the memoirs, but he decides he's going to do it to leave something for his wife. Because about that same time, he discovers he has a horrible throat and tongue cancer. So he wants to get this done for her. And it turns out that he's a darn good writer, and he enjoys the writing. And really the thing that keeps him alive as long as he lasts into July was the fact that he was working on these memoirs. So the idea that Grant believed he wasn't a good writer is true, but the idea that somehow somebody wrote it for him is not true. The memoirs of U.S. Grant is one of the major pieces of nonfiction in all of American history. Yeah. Some great writers have talked about this, but anyway.
I do have a Twain question.
Oh, good.
And I hope it comes, and I hope it makes enough sense to respond to. But I just read this. I've read this all my life by picking through it. And like a lot of people, this will probably be the first time I opened the front cover and read through to the end. It's funny.
It is, yeah.
Grant's a funny writer. And Twain played a role
yes, he did.
In the publication of it. Maybe some editing, I don't know. You can describe that. Is there a possibility that Grant is writing for his friend and editor? Is it possible Grant is influenced by the writing of Mark Twain?
Absolutely not. That's an excellent question. But no, there's absolutely no indication of that. If you look, for example, at his at the actual text of the memoirs, you see it's all in Grant's signature. Every once in a while there might be a word here and there, but it's not in Mark Twain's handwriting. It's in some of the people that worked with him. The kind of thing we all go through when we write a book. But no, there is absolutely no. This is Grant's thing, and the one thing that he did want to do, he realized even then that there are things being said about him and about the Civil War that are not true. And he wants to make sure that the lost cause, for example, doesn't come out. So he writes the book for that reason too. But the main reason is to come up with money for his wife. And the great story behind that is the Mark Twain Company, Charles L. Webster, wrote a check to Mrs. Grant when he was gone. The book is published after Grant has died. But a check for $250,000, which at that time was the biggest royalty check in American history. Overall, she got something like $450,000, and it did a quick check, and in today's money, that's about $11 million. And then on top of it, the thing that struck me, just found this out a couple months ago, is when she died, she left the money to her children. When they died, they left it to their children. There was a Grant Trust based on money made on the memoirs that stayed in existence until maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So this book has had a big influence, and it's never been out of print, but it's never been actually annotated the way that we've been able to do it.
Yeah, I was going to follow up with that. Can we claim that this is the first annotated version of the memoirs that fully utilizes the papers?
Yes.
Of
That's
Ulysses Grant?
excellent question. We could not have done this without those 32 volumes, because we found so much material in those 32 volumes that John Y. Simon helped edit that allowed us to verify things in there. It's another myth that this is, very inaccurate. It's not inaccurate. Are there mistakes? Sure there are. The guy's dying of cancer, for heaven's sake.
He didn't get to do a second.
He didn't get a check. Sherman got to do, I think it's 10 editions or something. But no, Grant is dying, and we found him to be incredibly accurate, because one of the great advantages he had is he did get to see the papers that later on went into the official records. Mm-hmm. So he was using some of them. Plus, he had an incredible memory. We don't think of Grant that way. He had an incredible memory. He remembered so many things that you wouldn't think he would remember, but he does. So this is as accurate as we could make it. And yes, indeed, there are, I think, about 2,100 annotations. There's never been anything that's been done like this.
It's going to be a very valuable research.
It's going to be a valuable, I think, for the common reader and for the scholar. And my favorite story is, the great thing about it, the footnotes are at the bottom of the page. And you can imagine.
You don't have to go to the back every time.
You don't have to go to the back. You got it right there, and if you want to ignore them, you can ignore them. But if they're going to be there, and so I think it's going to have a major impact, I think, on Grant scholarship, even more than what the presidency of Grant, because he doesn't talk about that. He talks about the war, so you're not going to help Chuck at all.
We're going to talk to Chuck here in a minute. I want to grab a few minutes out of our show to do something that we always like to do. And since we're on the memoirs, I want to do that. And that is, we are coming to you from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. And we have all sorts of cool stuff.
Yes,
you can see it behind me on the wall, albumin photos and so on, and collections on Grant and Lincoln. And part of our set, directly behind our two guests, if you peek past their shoulders, you will see the 3 original states in which the Grant's memoirs were produced. We're going to see the 3 things, the 3 products that a person could purchase. And you might even, John, pitch in on how they managed to market these things in the time when they were selling them. But let me just point out, these are 3 things that are all here at the shop and available for sale. Anybody can contact us and put them in part of the US Grant collection. On the left, as people are looking at their computers, you're going to see the green cloth shoulder strap edition from Charles Webster. And that's what we call the first trade edition. And that's what a person would buy off the shelf or subscribe and have sent to them. But for a little extra money, and a lot of extra money now if you buy it from me, you could get you could get one of the 2 publisher's presentation bindings. The one we're looking at right now is the calfskin, full leather calfskin binding. You'd pay extra for that. And then this is the right now we're looking at a 3/4 leather binding. Each one of them has a beautiful, well, the 2 of them have a beautiful medallion reproduced on it. When you find that calfskin version, it's very difficult to find a calfskin version that's in really good condition. That leather tends to fall apart. So if you find one that's actually in really great condition, buy it. Because there aren't that many of the calfskin ones out there.
But the other thing you might want to warn people about, another thing, if you open those editions, and you'll see written in Grant's handwriting, it's a facsimile. It's not a real thing. We get a lot of phone calls and emails saying, I have a first edition, and it's personally autographed by U.S. Grant.
Oh, my
No,
goodness.
it's not. It's everybody who buys one of these. And the way it was sold, and Twain did a great business job. You know, and you were talking about his role in all of this, but what they did, they hired former Union soldiers, dressed them in their uniforms, and they went from home to home in the cities, and farm to farm in the country. They gave them each a 35 or 50-page book telling them how to make sure that Bjorn buys that volume because he wants it right next to his Bible. And if he doesn't buy that, he's not a loyal Unionist. So, you know.
Right, brilliant. He had the salespeople.
He had the salespeople.
Well, it's the Grand Army of the Republic.
Although there were also charlatans who were selling books they said were written by Grant, had not been written by Grant. But.
Well, gentlemen, I have 1,000 questions for you, but apparently we have 1,000 viewers today. People are really taking advantage of the fact that we're doing a live online book signing.
Right.
So we got a lot of questions from from our customers at home. And the first one is John Sampson, is writing from St. Louis. Thank you, John. And John has a question for Chuck. The question is, Grant's #1 nemesis during his presidency was Charles Sumner. How much of Sumner's antipathy towards Grant was personal, and how much was a legitimate policy opposition? Thanks, John.
That's an excellent question. I'm glad somebody brought up Charles Sumner's name. I knew it would rise at some point here. Charles Sumner was Grant's nemesis. Charles Sumner thought that he should be Secretary of State in the Grant administration, and of course he didn't get the job. There's some evidence that he thought he should have been nominated for president in 1868, and he certainly didn't get that. Sumner believed that the Civil War was won in the Senate of the United States, not by generals, that they were lesser figures compared to United States senators. And throughout, well, for the rest of his life, he died in 1874, throughout that time, from the inauguration, even before the inauguration, until he died, he disagreed with virtually everything Grant did. And even when he agreed with him, he still yelled at him because he had a great contempt for Grant. And I think he felt that Grant, what does Grant know? In fact, you can see that in Sumner's letter. This man is uneducated. He doesn't really know about public policy. People like me, Charles Sumner, I know these things, and he should turn to me for advice. Well, Grant had another idea, actually, about what the country needed, and that he didn't actually need Charles Sumner's advice. It's interesting. Grant once said that the only man I wasn't myself with was Charles Sumner. And he didn't think he really needed to play that game in his cabinet with having Charles Sumner with him. So anything Grant proposed, there was a knee-jerk reaction from Charles Sumner against it, virtually everything. And Santo Domingo, the attempt to annex the Dominican Republic, was perhaps the best example. Sumner just condemned that effort on the part of the Grant. It is completely defensible, I think, but Sumner did not think so. And Fish, after a while, began to, as an armchair psychologist, believe that Sumner was crazy. And Sumner was
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Sumner was, yeah, he was beaten up, absolutely. But Sumner when we had the Alabama treaty negotiations, the Treaty of Washington negotiations, the British delegation came over and they met Sumner, who was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee until Grant got him kicked off. The British commissioners, one kept a diary, and it was a wonderful point in which he said, this man is an egomaniac. He believes only in himself, and it's true. Grant didn't think it was his obligation to stroke Charles Sumner's ego, and he never got over it. He never got over being more or less on the outs with the administration.
Okay. Another question from the audience. Thank you again. Now, this one I'm not sure is directed at either of you, so I'm going to throw it out there, and it's Jonathan Conforti. Thank you, Jonathan. But what was the reason Grant left Galena, Illinois? He was given a house by the people that loved him, but he turned his back on them. Why? Did he not want handouts? What did he think of his fame? And isn't there a quote of him saying he just wanted to be a normal man? Something like that.
Well, I can say a couple of things. Chuck, you probably know a heck of a lot more
Thanks,
about this. But Grant, I think what it came down to, imagine, put yourself in Grant's situation. He's been president. He's been the leading general of the Civil War. He's been president of the United States. He's toured the world and got an absolute hero's welcome every place he went. And then he's going to stop doing all those kind of things and live in a small little town like Galena. Yes, he'd be a hero of Galena, but I think he really came to see that his role in American society was much greater than just Galena. And yet he always said favorable things about Galena. He loved the people there. So I don't think it's any attempt to push Galena down. I think he just sees that his life is at that stage where he can do many more things.
I agree with everything John said. I would add a few things. First of all, Grant actually didn't live in Galena all that long.
That's right, yeah.
He went there a year before the war started. He was certainly down on his luck. He worked in his father's leather goods store. And then the war started, and as they say, the rest is history. After the war, he was head of the Army. He was in Washington, D.C. That was his assignment. That's where he was to be, and then he was in the White House. So he was in Galena in the summer and fall of 1868 when he was the nominee of the party. And he writes about, I'm really having a great summer.
Yeah,
I love it here.
Right.
I'm not going to be relaxed for very long.
Yes,
This is all going to hit me. So he loved that summer in Galena. But I think maybe in the back of his mind, there may have been a little bit of this. There were some people in Galena who added to that or contributed their mite to that reputation that he was a drunkard or didn't control himself. And I think, they were the Democrats of Galena who did that, but nonetheless, that would I think, make him feel, there are other places I can live, and he could live anywhere he wanted, of course, and he chose New York City after returning from his trip abroad. But we have to remember, I don't think Galena was in his blood.
Mm-hmm. He did identify as an Illinoisan.
He did,
especially during the war. He would sort of identified as an Illinois person.
Well, he had an Illinois regiment.
And he had an Illinois regiment that he commanded. Yeah, got his job
got
from
him
Governor
start.
Yates.
And Washburn.
Yeah,
Washburn is very. Yeah.
Now that's an important. Yeah, we
Well,
could spend 30 minutes talking about.
It just strikes me too that another issue that may have played a role that I don't know for a fact, but I think that Julia, his wife, would not have enjoyed staying in Galena.
Good point.
She didn't get along with his side of the family anyway, and she loved being in the White House. In fact, she doesn't get enough credit for taking the White House and refurbishing it when they were there. But it could be that he loved Julia with a passion that it's very difficult to really even explain. But if she was opposed to it, he's not going to go back to Galena.
Mm-hmm. She loved social life.
And she liked social
she
life.
Could have in New York and probably not Galena as much.
Yeah, right.
And I have another question, but I think now that we're talking about the First Lady, I want to move on to that topic with Chuck. Did you find that Julia embraced the role as First Lady? There's certainly a couple of episodes, The Gold Ring, where she plays a principal role in helping out
Yeah,
Grant.
Julia loved being in the White House, absolutely. This, if you read her memoirs, she loved social life. She liked being the center of attention. She was not a terribly complicated person, but she loved, reigning in Washington society, but never lost her essential simplicity. Yeah. In the evenings at the White House, you'd have the president and Julia sitting with a few friends, chatting, and they would have, of course, the required balls and receptions and so forth, which Grant didn't really like that much. Julia, I think, relished more. But she liked that, and she felt that, in a way, she felt it was her due. But Julia was quite interested in returning to the White House. Grant was thought of very highly by many people in the Republican Party. During the Hayes administration, Hayes was elected in 1876, of course, and then he didn't want to run in 1880. He said he wasn't going to run for a second term, and so many people turned to Grant. And Julia thought that would be a terrific idea, and hoped that it would work out. Some people wanted to run in 76, and Grant wrote a public letter in 75, and basically said, "I'm not going to do that." And he didn't tell Julia he was writing that letter and mailing it until after he had done so, because she would have been happy to stay after 76 as well.
Well, there's one other thing maybe we can add too that always intrigued me. I had a picture, it was a print actually, in my office at Mississippi State. You remember the whole family sitting there, right. And when somebody would come in, I'd say, "What's strange about that photograph or that picture?" And so finally come up with the fact that she's not looking at the camera. She's looking off to the side, and which also led to a historian like me to talk about that whole thing. The fact that she had an eye problem, and she always never wanted to have her picture taken looking face on, although there are some examples, because it would show that eye that was not particularly good. But yet Ulysses S. Grant absolutely loved her with a passion. I mean, they would hold hands during the presidency at the White House, and there's a great story where when he becomes president for the first time, she says to him, "Well, the president deserves a better looking wife than I am. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have surgery on that eye." Now, this is 1868, 69. I don't want eye surgery today, let alone back there. And he says, "No, I met you with that eye. I fell in love with you with that eye. I married you with that eye. We had children together with that eye. You're not going to do that. You're not going to do." And so there was this great romance, but in reality, she was the one person, I think, that could actually tell him to do certain things or not do certain things. And she played a major role, obviously, in his life during the war and afterwards. So just throw that in.
Let me add one thing,
yes,
which does connect with Grant's enemies. One of them was Henry Adams,
yes,
who thought that he ought to have a job under Grant when he became president in 1869. Arrogant, believed that he was part of the Adams family, the two presidents in the family. He didn't get the job, but then he began writing articles saying how bad this guy was. Within 5 weeks, he was saying Grant's administration is worse than Johnson's. The only thing Grant had done that Henry Adams could have reacted to was not give him a job. But anyway, I bring that up in connection with the First Lady. Later that year, he visited the White House. Adam Badeau took him to the White House, and it was one of those after-dinner settings that I was talking about. And Adams later wrote about this to a friend in England and said, "Oh, the First Lady, she's no more pretentious than some duchesses, and she squints like an isosceles triangle." And I thought, I just wanted to smash this guy. How could you say this? You're under their roof, receiving their courtesy, but that's the kind of arrogance from what today we would call the elite, who look down on this mediocre, that's the word that Adams used, man from the West, who certainly wasn't up to the presidency as an Adams was. And all of this fits together in what I like to term as Grant's embattled presidency, that these people were hounding him and trying to give him as worst press as possible from the get-go.
Yeah, trying to write a bad history while it was still happening.
Absolutely.
Right.
Hey, I want to get to another question from Doug in Richmond, Kentucky. And I'm going to stop a minute again in order to tell everybody, just draw your attention to everybody that's watching. You're all joining us in Abraham Lincoln Bookshop for A House Divided on Author's Voice because you're all over the world. You're at your computer, you've got your tablet. People have asked questions on their phone when they're sitting on the train going home from work. And I thank you for that. And this is how you get to meet, this is how we give you an opportunity to meet your favorite authors and meet fine scholars and meet authors in other genres. So thank you for participating, and thank you, Doug in Richmond, Kentucky. And here's your question. Grant brings down Jefferson Davis's government. Davis was victimized by incompetent and corrupt associates to whom he largely remained loyal. Do you see any irony in Grant being likewise victimized by his friends during the presidency? Give Chuck a first chance.
That's a good question, really. And I think to some degree he was victimized. I think that's been overplayed to some extent. Yeah, there were some wrongdoing during the Grant administration, but to be frank with you, much of that is overblown and was politically motivated, partisanly motivated by Grant's Democratic opponents and by Charles Sumner and people of that ilk. There were a few people that Grant, I think, held to himself a little too tightly, and probably the most important of those was Orville Babcock. I have felt obligated in writing this book to explore every one of those, or nearly all of those allegations of corruption during the Grant administration, and try to get to the bottom of what really happened. Grant was not involved in the whiskey ring. Orville Babcock, it's clear to me, was. If you read his correspondence with his lawyers, what they're trying to do is not come up with evidence of his innocence. There isn't any, but to suppress evidence of his guilt. And there's even an instance where one of his Confederates had his wife sew letters into her skirts so that government agents wouldn't discover them. I mean, there's a lot of rich material like that here. And Orville, I think, Orville Babcock was one who did betray the president. But Grant testified in his trial, that is, by means of a deposition. And I think this was a strike against him. But what we have to remember is that blow-up, the whiskey ring and the effort to undo it and uncover it and prosecute it, and then the Babcock trial. The Babcock trial was in 1876. That's at the end of the administration, after Grant has endured 7 years of crimination after crimination by his opponents. And I think, and in fact he says, Hamilton Fish records this in his diary, that Grant says, they've subpoenaed my messengers, my doorkeepers, my clerks. Everybody from the White House had to go to St. Louis and testify in this trial. And so he felt, they're out to get me. I'm going to circle the wagons. So Grant clearly stated over and over again in cabinet meetings that this is a politically motivated thing to try to undermine me. I'm the one who's really on trial. And he felt Grant was pretty thin-skinned, and he felt this was enough. This is sort of the last straw after 7 years of being what he felt was unfairly criticized. Now here's an instance where there was room for criticism, at least criticism of Babcock, and instead he did circle the wagons. Although after the trial, Babcock was fired. I mean, he was gotten rid of out of the White House.
Yeah, and I think, too, to add to what Chuck just said, too, Grant was a great believer in being loyal to his friends. I mean, people who had supported him. And I think the key point is really this. Grant saw this as an attack on on him more than on anybody else. I think you're right.
I'm going to take a minute to show the folks at home another couple of artifacts that we have here. Again, they're books, and this time they're artifacts that relate to Charles' book on the presidency. One of them is one of the two books that you mentioned earlier today, a fine first edition of Ulysses S. Grant, Politician by William Heseltine, and available for the folks at home. Chuck, do you have anything briefly to say about Heseltine that you didn't already say before? Is a man of his time, or did he?
He was definitely a man of his time.
Yeah.
Alan Nevins edited a series on American political leaders, and his Fish book was in that series as well. It won a Pulitzer Prize, by the way. Heseltine was a man of his time, the 1930s, when many, many Americans had doubt about capitalism for the obvious reasons. The Depression, capitalism has failed. Looking back at Grant's period and really the late 19th century in toto, there was a feeling that this is where it all started. This is where the system went off the rails, and the super rich have took over everything, and the nation has suffered ever since. And that narrative picked up where Grant comes in is, oh, he was just a crony of these people. He just did whatever they said. And there's not a lot of evidence of that. I mean, Heseltine doesn't have a great deal of evidence to say that from, but it's the mindset that he brought to that book. In many ways, it's more exculpatory of Grant than some of the other things being written at the time. But ultimately, there's a negative air that comes through it because of Heseltine's own disenchantment with capitalism and believing that Grant was just sort of a running dog with the capitalists of the time.
Mm-hmm. That actually brings up the other book from a presidential person that I wish to show, and this is George Boutwell's Why I Am a Republican. Now, for the folks at home, this is, I think it's 1884, 1886. It's basically a political biography for a political campaign, the Blaine Logan campaign, but it's written by George Boutwell, and George Boutwell is the Secretary of the Treasury, and very intimately involved with sort of some of the issues that Heseltine has opinions about, including, this is going to be give you an unfairly limited amount of time to discuss it, but one of my favorite chapters is when you write about the gold ring, when you write about the machinations of Jay Gould and John Fisk, and how they were super rich people who tried to manipulate the president, and he wouldn't be manipulated. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up.
Boutwell played a big role in
Boutwell was Secretary of the Treasury during that. And the gold ring, I mean, it's a very complicated story, and I'll keep it brief, but basically what they wanted to do, Gould and Fisk, was corner the gold market. And that was important because when they were cornering the gold market, it was the ratio between paper dollars and gold dollars. It wasn't gold as a commodity. It wasn't a commodity thing. It was basically, what's the currency of the country going to be? And they thought they could manipulate it in a way that would make them a lot of money. But for them to do that, they would have to have the federal government do certain things, basically refuse to sell its own gold so that they could not corner the market. The common story was, the Grant immediately sort of fell in with their plan, and they persuaded him to do this. I have isolated the very few times that those two men, Fisk and Gould, met with Grant, and each time he blew them off, said no. One time he's at his brother-in-law's house in New York, and Gould, comes in with the brother-in-law and starts hammering on Grant about this. And he has what's a plausible reason for doing this. And after he leaves, Grant yelled at the doorkeeper, which was something he never did, yelling at servants. He said, "Don't let this guy next to me anymore." So he's clearly not in the palm of the hand of Jay Gould and Jim Fisk. It's another thing that got blown all out of proportion. One of the things I felt, I got to look at every scrap of evidence to figure out what was really going on. I'm going to throw out another couple of questions, but one of them is I want to
give my apologies to some of our questioners. We're not going to get to every question. And I just want to thank everybody for sending in these questions and asking these questions. That's what we're trying to do here with Author's Voice, to give you a chance to meet your favorite authors. I'm going to ask a question here from Becky in Saratoga Springs, but also, Becky, it's a question I think that John answered, but I'm going to throw it out there because I want you to know what Becky's thinking. A new book by a popular biographer claims that Grant was an alcoholic and smoked 20 cigars a day. Are assertions like this true or the result of the lost cause narrative?
Well, I think, I'm guessing the person that's being talked about there is Ron Chernow, who won a Pulitzer Prize for an earlier book. But what he actually says in his book, which is even thicker than ours, I think I put two of them together, it's over 1,000 pages. But what he basically is saying is that Grant was a binge drinker. There were times when he would drink. Whenever Julia was around, he would not drink. Was he an alcoholic? Not in the sense that we would talk about, an alcoholic. And keep in mind, too, I think that alcoholism, the very term, meant something different in the 19th century. It was a moral failing, where today we see it more as an illness and something that needs to be dealt with. And certainly Grant did deal with it. For example, and I'm not just throw this to Chuck, I'm not aware of any time where he did a lot of drinking during his presidency, for example. And in fact, what seemed to be happening was even at social functions, he would often refuse to even have a glass of wine. I think Grant is one of these people that cannot hold any alcohol. And so I think he comes to see, as his life goes on, that he shouldn't be touching any. During the Civil War, there were times when he did drink. Some of the stories are just absolute mythology. And I think Ron Chernow is trying to figure out what all this means. And I think it's the same thing with Ron White in his book and others. But we're now looking at that issue from not a lost cause perspective, but from a perspective of what really was going on. But how would you deal with this?
Well, I certainly agree with you that I don't think I consulted a physician about Grant's physical shape and whether he might be what we might call an alcoholic, and I described his behavior and symptoms, and basically, I don't think you can detect a physical dependence on alcohol. He didn't need it to operate. But once again, his enemies, blew this out of proportion at the time. Harry Wilson being one of the most important of those, and John Rawlins, of course, was his chief of staff, who was a fanatic teetotaler, and I think historians have focused on his, telling Grant, you got to stop this, when really he wasn't doing that much. I make the point that Rawlins's blowing up about Grant and alcohol probably did more damage than anything Grant ever drank. I think Lincoln had a good response. Yeah. In so many words, he didn't say this, but this is the way he might have been thinking, so what? Yeah. He's winning the war. But as far as in the White House is concerned, I have receipts in which he purchased large quantities of alcohol. Chester Arthur was then the collector of customs in New York, and there are the customs slips, 55 cases of this nice wine to the White House, and Grant ordered all this wine for his cabinet members. This is not a sneaky guy, being afraid, and he could drink socially. Hamilton Fish wrote letters. He never drinks more than a gentleman should. Mm-hmm. And I've never seen him under the influence of incapacitated or even elevated by alcohol.
David Beadle writes from Downers Grove, Illinois. We're also going to count this as answered now.
Yes.
But more concisely, what was the real story of Grant and alcohol? Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Clearly, it's an issue that's very fascinating. It's something that is talked about over and over again. We have another friend, Norval, is writing from Louisville, Kentucky. Thank you, Norval. And to what extent was Grant involved with his brother or others in the sale of post-trader ships in the West. And did he personally profit? This is more of a general grant in the war. Did he profit from some of this shenanigans in the West with post-trading?
No, I don't think so. In fact, one of the things that's really kind of striking is I thought what you were going to is the famous order, throwing out all the Jews, not Jewish merchants, but all the Jews. But if you look at Jonathan Sarna's book, and he looks into this quite a bit, and it's just not an issue. Grant does not profit personally from anything. He is, I think, personally a very honest individual. Was it during the war? Were cotton traders making money? Of course they were. I mean, warfare is a horrible thing, and horrible things happen in warfare. But Grant, for example, in the issue of the order dealing with Jewish merchants, when he's president, he does all sorts of things, and my favorite one is his issue of dealing with the Indians, and who's going to take care of all this. And my favorite story is Sarna talks about this, where Grant appoints a Jewish head of all the Christian chaplains dealing with the Indians. That doesn't sound like somebody that would be, and there are other issues too. So no, I don't think so. I don't think he's making any money. One thing I should add too, that my wife likes to point out, he had problems with headaches, migraine headaches, which could at times replicate the symptoms of drinking too. But there's no indication of that either.
Well, we're running short on time, so I'm going to, obviously that's why people need to buy these books, because in an hour there's no way we could talk about all of these topics. John, I'm going to give you one sort of last question about the memoirs, because frankly, with apologies, we've talked about Ulysses S. Grant for an hour, and we only talked about this book at the top of the show. But this is, in my opinion, the version of the memoirs that you need to have. This is the first version of the memoirs that fully utilizes the papers of Ulysses S. Grant. But in Grant's text, and this is finally I get my own question. In Grant's writing, given his circumstances in which he's writing the book, do you find that Grant is very kind and forgiving to those with whom he has previously had military contretemps during the war? And if the answer is yes, does that detract from the value of the memoir?
Yeah, no. I think the answer is a great answer that you can always use with students. Yes and no. You can't be wrong that way. But no, Grant, in the memoirs, Grant says things very forthrightly, and about both Union commanders and Confederate commanders. He says things very forthrightly about some of the things that happened during the war. And I think being prejudiced, obviously, but the great thing about this and I can't go out without mentioning both David Nolan and Louis Gallo, who were editors on this thing, did a marvelous job. But one of the things I think that makes this book so valuable and why people need to look at it is because it does clarify a lot of questions that have come up over the years about the memoirs of U.S. Grant. So no, he does both. He holds some grudges like McClernand. He just couldn't stand John McClernand, but he says some nice things about some other people.
Okay, and then I also want to get one more question for you, Chuck, and your book is the one that has provided the most fruitful terrain for unanswered questions, and that's why I think this discussion of the presidency, even just this last hour, has been so fascinating, and therefore I want to cover something on my own that I'm not going to ask a question about because people at home need to think about it, and that is when we think of Grant as a bad president, one of the first issues that breaks down and becomes a problem for that is that people almost always immediately admit that he had good foreign policy chops and that he conducted good foreign policy. So this is a book where those who want to look at Grant and foreign policy need to consult this book and understand why we start to, our first move away from Grant as a bad president toward a much more effective president is his effectiveness in foreign policy. And I know you'd love to respond to that, but I'm going to move on to a question that I think is the central question, one of the central questions to Grant's presidency, and the one that I'd like both of you to discuss as much as you can in our limited time left. I think the biggest issue that President Grant had to face was the issue of Reconstruction, the issue of the relationship with his presidency, his administration, to the former Confederacy. And recent Reconstruction scholarship has started to redefine Reconstruction not as a separate thing from the Civil War, but a continuation of the Civil War. So starting with you, Chuck, what do you find Grant's response to the South and the South's continued intransigence effective or ineffective in his administration?
I think it varies. I think this movement to connect Civil War and Reconstruction is good. Grant always said what we need to do is to secure the results of the war. And that meant not just cementing the Union and making sure all the states are back in, but securing good treatment of the former slaves and the right to vote and so forth. So when we speak of Grant's Southern policy, or anybody's Southern policy, we tend to gloss over the fact that we're talking about 10 or 11 states here. And they all are demographically different. They were politically varied. And so in some states, there was more success in achieving the kind of regime and support for the former slaves than in other states. The truth be known, Grant inherited a terrible mess from Andrew Johnson as far as Reconstruction was concerned. That knockdown, drag-out fight between Congress and Johnson about the shape of Reconstruction really left a mess on Grant's table. And the other thing we have to remember about Reconstruction is that Grant basically tried to pursue a policy that would uphold the civil rights of the former slaves, the voting rights, but he also ran into utter and total intransigence on the part of the white Southern leaders. And overcoming that, after you have the Panic of 1873 and the country goes into a very serious depression, Northern public opinion backed away from truly aggressive measures to support Reconstruction regimes in the South, so that Grant did not achieve everything he wanted to. And because of various circumstances in each of the 11 states, different courses were followed that met with varying degrees of success. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through all those 11,
exactly.
but it's not a simple question. Gee, was he good or was he bad on Reconstruction? It's a lot more complicated than that.
Right, very complicated. John?
Yeah, I just want to add just a couple of things, just maybe simplistic things, but when we can talk to Chuck and get the real story. But one of the things that strikes me is that if you look at the American presidency and you look at it from Abraham Lincoln into the modern era, the only two presidents other than Lincoln that had anything to say about African American rights, etc., were Ulysses S. Grant and Lyndon Johnson. If you look at all the other presidents, you can say what you want, but they don't really do all that much. And I like to think in terms too of that and other issues, that Grant is the first modern president in American history. If you look at his foreign policy, you can see echoes of that in the 20th century. If you look at any number of things, he signed the first national park bill, the Yellowstone National Park. And then you just go on and on and on and on. There's just some examples. So this guy is not a loser, I think, as president, but he is the first of the modern presidents. He sets a stage for things that people are going to be doing later on, and yet he doesn't get credit for it.
We just had one thing on that point, and I'm glad you brought it up, and that is Grant was quite an effective legislative president.
Yes.
More than any of his predecessors, he went up to Capitol Hill. There's a room called the President's Room. He met with senators there. He met with representatives there. He had them at the White House. In fact, this is why some people like Sumner called him Caesar. He's trying to dominate us too much. But he was really a policy-driven president and felt that, although he always hung back and said, you know, Congress does its thing, I do mine, but basically he was quite an active, and I would say effective, legislative president.
Okay. And it's going to be in that book. It's going to be in that book. Let me wrap up the two books that we're talking about today, with thanks to Charles Calhoun and John Marszalek. In this case, in John's case, the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. It is $39.95 from the Belknap Press of Harvard University Press. That name rings a bell. And, first edition, 784 pages. Like I said, $39.95. It will be available after the event. If you're watching this on our YouTube archive, it will be available signed and in first edition after the event. And then you'll have a signed first edition of Grant's memoirs. Charles Calhoun, The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, from the University Press of Kansas, also in first edition, 725 pages, illustrated, $39.95. Also available after the event. The gift-giving season is coming up, and I assure you, your friends and loved ones don't have either of these books. They're brand new. So order them up. We'll send you a signed first edition and ship it right out to you. We're running short of time, and usually I'd like to tell you about more of our upcoming shows, but there are just 3 of them that are really important to me that I want to make sure that the folks at home know about. Just announcing, this is going to be on our website very quickly, but just announcing now, on October 19th at 3:30 in the afternoon, our program Solved, our mystery program hosted by Libby Fisher-Hellman, features Laura Caldwell. Laura Caldwell is here with Anatomy of Innocence, Testimonies of the Wrongfully Convicted. That's really a get. That's going to be a great show. So if you're interested in mysteries, be here on October 19th at 3:30 for Solved, Laura Caldwell. Day after that, October 20, A House Divided returns. Brian Dirk is here with Lincoln in Indiana, and Guy Fraker is here with Following Lincoln in Illinois. We're grabbing both of those fine authors because they will be in town for the US Grant Symposium, for the US Grant Symposium, the Abraham Lincoln Symposium at the Chicago History Museum, the ALA, Abraham Lincoln Association. And then on November 1st, somebody who's already couldn't help getting mentioned in our show, Ron Chernow, will be here on November 1st at 2 in the afternoon with his enormous new biography on who?
Who was it? Yeah.
Grant. Ron Chernow will be here with Grant on November 1st. Many other shows are on our fall schedule. So go to our website, authorsvoice.net, and consult the upcoming shows. There's going to be something for you to see. Gentlemen, if we had more time, we could tell them all about the books, but they're going to have to buy them and read them. So thank you very much, Charles Calhoun, for coming to Chicago and Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. Thank you very much, John Marszalek, for returning to Abraham Lincoln Bookshop and Author's Voice. And thank you to everybody who helped produce this program, the staff at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, Dan Weinberg, the president of Author's Voice and Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, to everybody who came in today. Now you're going to have your chances to ask a question. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody at home for joining us on A House Divided. Have a great day.